Your hand hold me still. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm fearfully and wonderfully
Testing. Can you hear me now? You should be able to hear me now. It looks like it's coming through on the mic. Do I know sign language? No. No, I don't know sign language. Actually, I do. Apple. That's the only sign language I know. Can you hear me? Okay, good. You can hear me. Well, the stuff that you couldn't hear me saying was all the stuff that I normally say at the beginning of our Tuesday night theology chats. What we usually do. Hi, Dad. Hi, Debbie. Thanks for pointing out that you couldn't hear me. So we'll just jump right in. Sunday morning, Pastor Melissa was preaching. First of all, we're still going through our series on Joshua. And we've gotten up to the Jordan River. And so Pastor Melissa was preaching on Sunday morning about the Israelites crossing over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. They've been spending all these years and years and years wandering through the wilderness. Here they are, and they're about to cross over. So she preached about that on Sunday morning, and specifically the faith that it took to kind of step into the river and step over into the Promised Land. And so what we're going to do this week, kind of like last week, we can take this story and look at the different steps of it, the little different pieces of it, and then we can take that and apply that to our own lives and our own stories. And so I'm going to try and break that down a little bit, kind of review what she said, and then talk about another piece that we didn't get to talk about. So to review real quick, Pastor Melissa talked about, first of all, God told Joshua and the people to, first of all, consecrate yourself. So that was the first thing he told them to do. Now, consecrate, what does that mean? To consecrate means to dedicate something or someone to a religious purpose, or to God, really. And so what he's telling the people to do, all the people here, he's saying, dedicate yourself to the purposes that I have for you, to the purposes that I have for the people of God. It's a little different than when we say we're going to consecrate this bowl for the temple, or we have the I guess in a way you could say the plate and the pitcher and the cup that we have at the harbor, like those are consecrated for using for communion, because really that's the only thing we use it for. And so what he's telling them is, I want you to dedicate yourself, your life, to my purposes before we even get started, because I need you to be all in on this. And so that's what he's telling the people to do. And so there's this time of, before they even get to the river, they stop and they do this cleansing, where they do these ritual purifications, and all of this stuff, where they kind of take stock and say, yes, this is what we're committing ourselves to, because the people of God need to be committed to the will of God. And so that's what he's telling them. First of all, before we even step foot over here, consecrate yourself to God. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is kind of what Pastor Melissa was focusing on Sunday, was that they needed to take a step of faith. She was rightfully pointed out that before they even crossed the river, well, first of all, I just want to pull this video back up, because this is she did point out that the Jordan River at that point was at flood stage, and so this was kind of what it looked like, the amount of water that's rushing through here, and the size of the river. I mean, this is not just like a slow moving stream that you're crossing here. This is a lot of water rushing. You've got some older people, you've got kids, you've got livestock that you got to get across this river. So it's not just splish splash and you're across. And so this is the stuff that the priests had to walk into with the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is like the symbol of God's presence with the people of Israel. Okay? And so the priests are walking into this before anything has happened. And so for the priests and for the people of God, like, yeah, we're going to walk into this river, but this makes no sense because we're going to get washed away. So the priests have to step into the river before anything happens. And that's that step of faith, where they have to step out trusting that God is going to do something. So it was definitely a step of faith for the priests carrying the ark. And again, this is something that we run into in our own lives, because a lot of times God will say, okay, I need you to consecrate yourself, set yourself up, dedicate yourself to my will for you, and then I want you to step out and do this thing. And my experience with God, and a lot of people's experience that I've talked to, is he likes to ask us to step outside of our comfort zone. And those are oftentimes things that it requires trust. And so for these priests that are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they're like the lead people heading out into the river here. This was a big step of faith. They had to trust that God knew what he was doing. They had to trust that he wasn't going to let them get swept away by this stuff. I guess I can get rid of that water. And so, yeah, for the people of Israel, first they had to consecrate themselves, but then also they had to make that step of faith and step out there trusting that God was going to be able to take care of them, able to do what he said he was going to do, and just be there with them as they're carrying this. Whoops, just knocked my mic all over. As they're carrying this ark that symbolizes God's presence with them. And so for them, consecrate yourself, then step out in faith. God asks the same thing of us. Dedicate yourself to me and my purposes, and then I'm going to ask you to step out of your comfort zone to follow me. God does that all the time, really. The next piece of this, and Pastor Melissa talked about this too, is they consecrate themselves, they take a step of faith, and then God acts. God shows up. The Israelites, like as soon as they stepped out into the water started backing up. And so it's like, well, we've stepped out in faith, we've trusted you, God. And so now God shows up and he starts to, I mean, not that he wasn't there before, but now he starts to act and he backs up the water after they've stepped out in faith. I won't say that he doesn't, but it seems to me like God oftentimes waits for us to act to say, okay, let me do some miracles here. It just seems to be the way he likes to do. He likes to honor our obedience and our acts of faith by showing up in ways oftentimes that are even bigger than we expected. I could probably tell all kinds of stories about ways that God has, like once you step out, God shows up and it may not even be anything like what you were expecting, but it's always better in the end. So that's the third piece there. First of all, they consecrate themselves. Secondly, they step out in faith. Third, God acts responding to their obedience. And so that was all kind of review from Sunday. But there's two more important pieces of this story that are kind of my favorite parts of this story, actually, and they didn't get even touched on Sunday, so we're going to talk about them now. So the next thing that that happens is all of Israel gets across the river. Okay, I can't. Just a side note, I can't read this story or hear this story being the age that I am and not think of trying to ford the river in the Oregon Trail game. Like, this is always what comes to mind when I think of this story. Anyway, that's a side note. So all of Israel gets across the river. They forded the wagons and they got across. And God says to Joshua, I'm going to read the first 7 verses of chapter 4 from the book of Joshua. It says, when the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, 1 from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests are standing, and carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. Now, I'm going to pause right there. I kind of feel bad for the priests, because everybody else got across. They're still standing in the middle of the river. Anyway, so Joshua called together the 12 men that he had appointed from the Israelites, 1 from each tribe, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the Israelites, to serve as a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask you, what do these stones mean? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. And so that's kind of an important piece of this story, because they all get across and God says, okay, hold up. Don't just rush off from here. We need to do something to commemorate this. And so he tells Joshua to send these guys in. Now, there's one guy for each of the 12 tribes, and they're supposed to grab a rock and heft it up onto their shoulder. It doesn't say anything about the size of the rock, but he picked 12 guys, and if I know guys, there had to be some competition going on as to who was bringing back the biggest rock for their tribe. So I don't think they brought back little pebbles. My guess is they brought back some decent sized rocks, not huge, but decent sized, because they wanted their tribe to have the biggest rock. That'd be my guess. But he tells them to do this because he wants this to be a memorial to the people of Israel. Now, why does he do that? He wants them to remember, because we, as human beings, so easily forget the things that God does for us. So easy. We seem to be a people who are like, well, what have you done for me lately? And we forget all of the good things that God has done for us. And so God is telling the people, I want you to bring these rocks out and set these up as a memorial so that you remember what the Lord did for you. Because it's going to be easy for you once you get into the promised land, once life is easy, it's going to be easy to forget where you were right now. And so for us, when God acts, we need to remember. We need to do something in our life to remember the things that God has done for us. And a lot of times, I know a lot of people like journaling is helpful for them because it's like, okay, perfect example. I know the ladies' prayer group, they keep track. They're like pros. They keep track of all the prayer requests that they pray for at the ladies' prayer group, and then they mark off. Well, this prayer was answered. This prayer was answered. This prayer was answered. And then come the end of the year, Pastor Melissa goes and says, "Hey, what were we praying for this year that got answered?" And at the beginning of the year, they just started listing things off, places where they asked God to show up, and He did. And so they remembered that. It's important for us to remember where God has worked in our lives for several reasons. First of all, it helps us fight the attitude that, well, God isn't doing anything for me. When things aren't going the best, when things are going hard, it's easy to think that God has forgotten about you. Well, when you go back and you start remembering all the things that He's done for you and all the places where He showed up, it kind of offsets that a little bit, and you're like, oh yeah, you know what? He has been pretty good to me. So that's one thing. Another thing is, I've heard it described as a faith bank, where God shows up and He does something great for you, and you kind of make a deposit in your faith bank. Like, yeah, I can trust God with this. I can trust God with this. And then He does something else, and you make another deposit. And you keep making these deposits in your faith bank so that when the time comes and He asks you to do something again, to step out, remember, He asks us to step out in faith. When He asks you to do that, you go back and you remember all these things that you've deposited in your faith bank. And you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. So I can trust Him with this. And so then it's, in theory, easier to step out in faith. I say in theory because it's never easy to step out in faith, but that's what we're often called to do. And so, yeah, the fourth point there is that we need to remember how God acts in our lives, how He shows up. And then the last part here is that God tells them to tell. Tells them to tell. I'm going to read the last part of Joshua 4 there. And it says, Joshua set up at Gilgal the 12 stones that they had taken out of the Jordan. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what He had done to the Red Sea when He dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. He's telling them, you need to remember this, but then you also need to tell it. He's telling them, you're going to have kids someday, and they're going to be walking by and say, what's this thing going on here? And then you get the opportunity to say, well, let me tell you a story. And then just tell them about for the people of God, for the people of Israel. And again, this is something that is so applicable to us because we step out in faith. God acts, He shows up, and then we remember that. But we don't just remember that, we share that. Okay? it's important to share how God has shown up in our lives, how God has worked in our lives, how God has saved us, how God has transformed us. I think about the lost audio again. Still there? Debbie's saying I lost audio. Not sure why. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? Well, hopefully this is back. If not, I'll just keep going. It's important to tell that, because that's our witness. That's our testimony. Thanks, Scott. Thumbs up to you, Scott. That's our testimony as followers of Christ, is we have the opportunity to tell people what God has done for us and how he's changed us. And that's what he calls us to do. Jesus tells us, you will be my witnesses. And that's part of our job as the people of God. And so those are five things I think that are, you just take this story, break it down into these parts. And then that's really, I mean, you can just apply that to your own life, your own story. There's plenty of places where, like, God is telling us, I need you to consecrate yourself. I need you to step out in faith. I need you to, number 3 is him. Then he responds and acts in your life. And then we need to remember that, and we need to share that. We need to tell others about that. Now, there was something that I wanted to point out. I have always heard this story and thought, for some reason, I don't know why, it doesn't say it in the story, but I've always thought, like, they probably brought these rocks out and they built what's called a cairn, where they just stack up these rocks, and you've got this pile of rocks. I guess when I think of a monument, I think of something tall. Maybe that's what it is. But I was doing a little bit of research, and they set this monument up at Gilgal. Now, I don't expect that there's a whole lot of Hebrew scholars out there listening tonight, but Gilgal in Hebrew means circle of stones. So I don't know this for a fact because we don't know where this memorial is, but it may well have been something more like that, where they had these laid out in a circle. We don't know. It doesn't say specifically, but that was just something that I was reading through here, and I found that out, and I was like, oh, that's new to me. So I thought I'd share that. One other thing I wanted to point out, these are kind of the random miscellaneous bits that you're getting now. The passage that talks about this memorial, it says in there that the stones are there to this day. Let's see, verse 9. It says, Joshua set up the 12 stones that had been in the middle of the Jordan at the spot where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant had stood. And then it says, and they are there to this day. I just want to point out, if this isn't obvious, it was there at the day of the writing of this passage. We obviously don't know where these are. They may well still be there. We don't know. They may have been scattered. We don't know. So, yeah, it kind of like Stonehenge. Although, you think about Stonehenge, I don't think they were hefting those rocks up and carrying them out of the riverbed. That would be my guess. But I highly doubt there is anything that big. But yeah, that's this week. We crossed over the River Jordan. We set up a memorial to remember how God had worked in our lives. And next week, we're coming up to the city of Jericho, and we're going to... That'll bring out some Elvis. Didn't he do Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho? Maybe I'll do that. So anyway, that's where we're going next week. We're going to Jericho. So I will see you Sunday. And if not Sunday, I'll see you Tuesday night. Adios.